the tide might be turning in a number of ways. And in warfare, it's generally not one thing that changes or happens that creates a defeat or victory. But if several things come together, then they can create the momentum. And at the moment, I should think Putin is a lot less content than he was 6 weeks ago or even a few months ago.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had former British Colonel Hamish to Bretton-Gordon on the show, who's walked us through these comments from Donald Trump, who says he's pissed off at Putin, who's not really negotiating the end of a war. Surprise, surprise there. We've also spoken to him about kind of what's happening on the front line. He's a chemical weapons expert, so he's spoken to us about chemical weapons being illegally used by Russian troops on Ukrainian troops. So all that today, and kind of an update on Donald Trump and his, I guess, quest to get a proper ceasefire deal over the line. And it looks like he's switching back to Ukraine's side. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, former British Colonel, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, the big story that we need to start with is these comments from Donald Trump to NBC. Here's what he said to a journalist at NBC, just for our viewers. He said, if Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on oil, on all oil coming out of Russia. That would be if you buy oil from Russia, you can't do business in the United States. There will be a 25% tariff on all oil, a 25 to 50-point tariff on all oil. What was your reaction to these comments, Hamish?
Well, I suppose, first of all, a positive reaction, because for the last 5 or 6 weeks, President Trump, in his negotiations with Putin and Zelensky, he and his team seem to be siding more with Russia than they have with Ukraine, which is in Congress. Let's not forget, it was Russia who invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, 2022. So, and that has left a really bad sort of taste in the mouth of, particularly us lot in Europe, who are going to do the heavy lifting. So, over the weekend and the last few days, for Trump to sort of change his direction, and I think he used some very undiplomatic language as well when he was describing Putin and the fact that Putin was really beginning to, I think, to put it delicately, hack him off. So it's a hopefully a move in the right direction. Hopefully a sign that actually Trump is now realizing who the good guys, as he would call them, really are. But I suppose the corollary to it is that you would have thought that they were doing this anyway. But let's put that aside. If it means that Russia is not going to get the trillions of rubles that it currently gets from its selling its oil and gas around the world, which is feeding its war machine at the moment, then that is a good thing. Let's hope this is a really major change by the Trump administration and the man himself to try and put the pressure on Putin to come to the ceasefire table rather than just expect the Ukrainians to kowtow to Trump and make all the concessions themselves. It seems that actually Putin has been calling all the shots so far. He's got exactly what he wants. He doesn't appear to be interested in peace at all at the moment. So the only way that peace will come about, and a just peace for the Ukraine people, I think, is if the Americans put serious pressure on Putin. And let's hope that is what Trump is beginning to do.
This oil that you mentioned, Hamish, yes, this is feeding the war. This is paying the bills. This is paying for troops. This is the only proper money that Russia has in their dwindling economy right now. So I wonder how serious Vladimir Putin will take these threats of further tariffs, because he probably knows that without this money from oil in Russia, that they wouldn't be able to afford to keep the war going.
Well, it's true that the Russian economy is in a really difficult position at the moment, almost in free fall. We understand, inflation rates are ghosting in the high 20%. Interest rates are of a similar fashion. And the only thing keeping the Russian sort of economy going is by making tanks and bullets. But that is funded by the oil industry. Now, we know that the reserves, gold reserves, et cetera, I expect, except for those, stashed in Putin's dacha and those of his inner circle, there ain't much in the state sort of gold vaults at the moment. So it is thought that the Russian economy is in a really tenuous position. And, Putin is a smart bloke. He probably realizes that it wouldn't take much to crash the whole thing and his deck of cards come tumbling down. So something like this, and if Trump is determined to put the squeezes on the Russian economy, he is probably the only person in the world that can do it. And let's hope that that Putin realizes this. So yeah, this could be a major step forward, and it might signify the sort of turning of the tide, which has been flowing very much for the Russians for the last year or so. This might start to turn against them.
And the other thing about that, Hamish, is that so many experts, and pretty sure you yourself have said this as well, so many people have said the good thing about Donald Trump is that his unpredictability might mean that he might swing back in favour of Ukraine, which hopefully does these conversations hopefully mean that that's what he's doing. But the other part of this NBC interview, Hamish, was in response to Vladimir Putin last week. He called for a UN-backed temporary administration in Kyiv to allow elections to take place. Trump responded to this in this NBC phone call. He said, "You could say that I was very angry, pissed off when Putin started getting into Zelensky's credibility because that's not going in the right direction. New leadership means you're not going to have a deal for a long time." Now, I found these comments incredibly contradictory. To say that you're pissed off at Putin for questioning Zelensky's credibility after the last few weeks of what we've been covering, Hamish.
Well, you're right. Trump's ambiguity is hugely frustrating. From one day to the next, you don't know what he's going to say, which, when it comes to, international politics and life and death, is not the greatest position to be in. But at least Trump now is seeming to realize the gravity of the situation. And Putin suggesting the UN take over Ukraine is ridiculous, not least because the Russians are on the Security Council and have a veto. So the UN Security Council, that is. So in effect, the Russians would be controlling Ukraine, which is what they want. And thank heavens Trump is smart enough to realize that. But equally, he could change his mind and say something different tomorrow. But the hope is that that he will very much side behind Ukraine now. Although I think he's also said over the weekend about the so-called rare earth mineral deal, which seems to be the key driver that Trump wants to pay reparations for all the military hardware that America has given Ukraine. So again, that's something, another little bit out of left field. But the more he puts the pressure on Putin, I think the better it will be, and the more likely we'll see a ceasefire sooner rather than later. And the final bit on this, Maddie, of course, Zelensky has already said he will step down if that would bring a ceasefire. But Putin will be careful what he wishes for, because whoever replaces Zelensky could be even more hardline. And a lot of people are suggesting it's General Zaluzhny, who is the current ambassador here in the UK from Ukraine. And we've known him when he commanded the Ukraine forces. He is pretty hardline and would probably, be as hard, if not harder, over than Zelensky's been.
Hamish, on Air Force One, Trump told reporters that he still thinks that Putin is a man of his word. He still thinks that he wants peace pretty much. But from these comments, it seems that maybe behind closed doors, Trump is now, I guess, discovering that maybe Putin won't be agreeing to a ceasefire under any terms that would somewhat protect Ukraine and not give Putin everything he wants.
Well, it's very easy to be critical of Trump. We know that he swings, left and right and roundabout, really as the wind blows and changes direction, which is, I think, incredibly frustrating. And it must be terrible for the Ukrainians and President Zelensky, but also the leaders in Europe who thank God now have realised that actually Europe does need to rearm and does need to provide a credible conventional deterrence, which in effect is, I think, one of the plans that Trump had hatched and comes to fruition. But his sort of acquiescence to Putin over the last 6 weeks has been really disturbing. Seemingly to give all the advantage to the Kremlin. So at least now, hopefully, he is realizing, hopefully, somebody who really understands these things, in depth and understands the Russians and what they're really at, not what they appear to be at. And they are briefing Trump and have made him realize that the bad guy is Putin. And what Trump must do is to put pressure on Putin to come to the negotiation table and create a ceasefire that is fair and acceptable to the Ukraine people, not and doesn't sort of, celebrate the aggression that Putin has shown.
Yeah.
There is no way that he should be given all this land that he claims. So, yeah, there are positive steps coming, and let's hope that Trump realizes that the main advantage to him and ability to make his deals and and make money out of this war is to back the Ukrainians and not the Russians.
Does it seem kind of from an outside perspective, Hamish, that these negotiations that Steve Witkoff has been orchestrating with Russia have kind of gotten to a standstill, that they're starting to realise that Russia are not as easy at playing ball as they thought they might be, because obviously there's so much that Russia is not willing to give up, and that now Trump is realising that maybe the way in which to get Russia to do what he wants is to actually, as you say, go hard on them and put the pressure on Putin.
Yeah, I think it's taken a few weeks for Trump to realise that doing a business deal doesn't always work when you're trying to negotiate basically war. Doing negotiations in warfare are not the same of negotiating, the sale of a building. And hopefully he's now realized that there is a difference when you're trading in dollars to when you're trading in blood. And I think for the first 6 weeks, Putin has really, run Trump ragged, had him round his finger, because Putin is by far the better sort of wartime and war negotiator than Trump is. Trump might be a better house salesman, but hopefully is learning fast and learning that actually the way to do a deal on the battlefield is to show that you are strong and powerful and that you're not just there to make a quick buck. So the penny appears to have dropped. And let's hope that Trump continues in this vein and doesn't go back to trying to do a deal involving dollars and gold rather than trying to save lives.
While visiting Murmansk a few days ago, Hamish, Vladimir Putin, he said that he intends to wipe out Ukraine, saying, now it looks like we'll finish them off. Now, we know that Trump has been saying that Putin wants peace. He thinks that he wants peace just like Ukraine does. But comments like this, does it look like someone who wants the war to end?
No, absolutely not. And I've written frequently in the Telegraph exactly this, that Putin has absolutely no interest in a ceasefire and peace. Putin thinks he's winning. And, all the comments coming out of the White House the last 6 weeks really would underwrite that view to Putin. So that's why I think it's been so disappointing, the way that Trump and his team have tried to negotiate. You cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in his mouth. I think Winston Churchill famously said about Hitler. And in effect, Trump's had his head in Putin's mouth, as it were, to use that sort of vernacular. And hopefully he's now realizing that that is not the best way to peace. and the best way is to be strong and to show that you mean business. And the final piece on this, Putin has been telling us for years that he wants to recreate the old Soviet Union. He wants all those states that are now in NATO, like the Latvia and Lithuania, and also sort of Romania and Bulgaria, along with Ukraine. He wants them back in the Russian Federation to recreate the Greater Russia, the old Soviet Union. So, just taking Ukraine would be one small element to his grand plan. So that is what hopefully the White House and Trump are beginning to realize, and that they are the ones who can really make a difference here. But they've got to be firm. They just can't acquiesce to Putin's demands, and they've got to make him listen. And they are the most powerful military on the planet, and they have the military power and the financial power to bring this war to an end. And let's hope they use it.
Yeah, on that note, I think it was Nikki Haley who said that dictators are actually wildly transparent. They're telling you what they're going to do, so you might as well believe them. But Hamish, Senator Mark Kelly, he's been a staunch critic of the way that the Trump administration have handled these negotiations. He tweeted, "I'm angry too. I'm angry with the dictator Putin. He's a murderer. But I'm also angry with Trump, who made the boneheaded move of giving away the best pieces of leverage before the negotiations started." So can you kind of walk our viewers through what leverage the United States had over Putin that he did give up?
Well, I think first of all, the psychological leverage. In any negotiations, you really don't want to tell your enemy, as it were, in negotiations for war, what you're going to do, and probably more important, what you're not going to do. And certainly in his rantings with Europe over the last few weeks, and I think the pathetic Europe, and the leak of the intelligence leak on Signal, which we discussed previously, in effect, that's exactly what Trump and his team have done. They've told Putin what they are going to do and what they're not going to do. And when you're in that position, then knowledge and intelligence is everything. So it's giving Putin the advantage. He's sort of one step all of the time. And the other element to this is appearing to back Putin's position rather than the West's and Ukraine's position. So really encouraging Putin to go on. It just strikes us all as absolute madness. And when the Americans stopped intelligence sharing and they stopped weapons going, again, that gave Russia a great advantage. So hopefully all those things that the senator has talked about has now resonated in the White House, and they realize that the errors they're doing, and the early indications over the weekend is that has sunk in. And let's hopefully Trump can do his job to produce a just peace. But it's not going to happen without determined action from the Americans, because it's the last thing that Putin wants at the moment. There are rumblings in the Kremlin. People are starting to question Putin. One of his limousines blew up recently. We hear from MI6 and CIA about sabotage expected, across Europe, and we've seen fires in several capital cities. But it would be naive of people to think that actually, even in this super woke time, that Western spy agencies, are not capable of exactly the same sort of thing. So I think we are at a pivotal time, and let's hope that Trump can make the tide turn against Putin so that we can get the just ceasefire that everybody wants.
Well, let's get into this limousine exploding, Hamish. It caught fire in Moscow at the same time that Putin had been showing signs of paranoia. He had his own guards patted down for weapons. So do you think Putin is being targeted within Russia?
There are rumblings, rumors that people in a circle are losing patience with Putin, and the way that the Russian leadership works, it is all pretty unpleasant and cynical, and Putin has been the biggest dog in this fight in the Kremlin for the last 25 years. But there are indications that that he might not be. There might be others. This explosion, it's not his purse. He wasn't anywhere near it, but it's a sort of demonstration of what might happen. I think the second element to this is the babushkas, who are the mothers of Russia. Now, when 17,000 Russian soldiers died in Afghanistan, they marched on the Kremlin in 1984 and made the Kremlin retreat in defeat from Afghanistan. Now, many people have wondered why, they haven't been as vocal this time. And I understand it from Russian experts that the situation is actually fairly straightforward. Although there are nearly 1 million casualties, Russian casualties, the view of the rank and file in Russia, the Russian mothers, the babushkas, is that a lot of those soldiers are prisoners, as we know, but also they're people are making a fast buck. And Russian soldiers are paid a fortune in Russia, way above the sort of living national wage, really bribed to go to the front line. But when they die, their families are not paid compensation. And this is beginning to rise the mothers of Russia who are creating discontent. So there are a number of pressures, I think, on Putin in particular, around the Kremlin and around people realizing actually the folly of what's happened, and actually 1 million casualties is not worth it, because this is not a patriotic war for the majority of Russians. So yeah, there are murmurings, which is why I think, as we mentioned earlier in this video, that the tide might be turning in a number of ways. And in warfare, it's generally not one thing that changes or happens that creates a defeat or victory. But if several things come together, then they can create the momentum. And at the moment, I should think Putin is a lot less content than he was 6 weeks ago or even a few months ago.
And then we had those comments from President Zelensky, Hamish, saying that he does think that Putin will die soon. And on the note of these troops, numerous guests on my show have said that if signs start to point to Russia losing the war, not being able to keep up the war, then he will be targeted by his own Russians who rely on this income from being soldiers. As you said, they get paid more than the minimum wage. So troops do rely on being troops. And if they start to see that Putin is losing the war, that they will start targeting him themselves.
Well, I think, as you said, there is a certain amount of paranoia coming out of Putin's camp at the moment. There will always be people. It's the way that the Russian state has always worked. You have one dictator, but there'll be people lining up to take over, as there always have been. Really since the Russian Revolution back at the beginning of last century. So one would expect that, and failure is not something, doesn't end well for tyrants who fail, because there'll be somebody else to take them up. So there are lots of things happening at the moment, and everything seemed to be going well for Putin, especially with his negotiations with Trump. But things are changing, and as soon as you say, the perspective that Putin is losing, his days are numbered. And Zelensky's comments that Putin will soon be dead are, you can probably read into them whatever you like. But again, I think it would be naive for people to think that there are not Ukraine agents and other agents who are conducting, espionage and operations against the Russian state. That is the way these things work. So whether somebody, a Russian or others, is trying to eliminate Putin, who knows? But it wouldn't be surprising.
Hamish, let's just have a quick look at the state of the war. Is it clear who has been advancing and who hasn't been? You've had insiders tell you that Russian troops have been carrying out illegal chemical gas attacks on Ukrainian troops in the eastern region of Donbass. Can you kind of walk me through this and the state of the situation going on in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think we're at a really interesting time at the moment. as the weather has changed in this country, it's also changed in Central Europe, and we're going into what our soldiers call fighting season. I mean, that's a bit of an old term. It was when the ground dried out and you could gallop your horses across the prairie, sort of thing, or your tanks. So that fighting season is changing. For the last few months, though, the Russians have been making advances, at huge costs. They've recovered a lot of Kursk that was taken by the Ukrainians in the summer, and they've been making a few gains in the Donbass. But actually, predominantly, as you mentioned, huge use of chemical weapons, of chloropicrin, a riot control agent, riot control gas, which is surprising. It's not on the front page of every newspaper because it's illegal against the Chemical Weapons Convention. But I was only talking to some medics this morning in that area who confirmed over the weekend they had masses of chemical attacks, and they said it is regular. It's all the time, and it's being effective because at the moment, not every Ukrainian soldier has a gas mask, but it is allowing the Russians to make small gains. They put a load of drop gas from drones, this chloropicrin. It doesn't kill people, but it's incredibly unpleasant. And you've got to, if it's in your trench, you've got to get out of your trench. The Russians then follow up with masses of artillery and some direct fire and take a bit of land. And then literally, the next night, the Ukrainians recover it. So the very small movements on the front line. But for the last probably couple of months, Russia has been making more gains. But at the moment, everything is pretty stagnant and things don't seem to be going anywhere. Whether that's because people are negotiating, but of significance, I think also, Ukraine's made some very important strikes deep into Russia. Last week, attacking a major Engels Air Force base, destroying 96, I think it was, cruise missiles. That is you think these missiles are several $1 million each. That is a big loss. And also, just before that, Ukraine destroyed 4 Russian helicopters, again, deep into Russia. So these, are showing Ukraine's capability to strike deep. And again, psychologically, good for the Ukrainians, probably bad for the Russians. But on the front lines, pretty static. But, an industrial amount of chemical weapons are being used, and nobody's really saying much about it.
And I wonder that, Hamish, because a lot of the time when you and I have these interviews, we do discuss chemical weapons. Of course, you're an expert in the area, so it's good to have you on the show when we are discussing that. But does Ukraine then do a tit-for-tat situation where they get a hold of chemical weapons and fight back, or are they respecting the fact that it is banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention, as you said?
Yeah, as far as I know, absolutely. As far as I know, the Ukrainians don't have any chemical weapons. Of course, they gave up their nuclear weapons in 1996 for the Budapest Memorandum, which, in a way, is the reason that this war started, because Russia, America, and Britain swore that they would protect Ukraine if it gave up its nuclear weapons. And of course, as we know, that Putin completely ignored that and invaded. We've always known that the Russians have a chemical weapons program, and I'm talking to you from Salisbury, where they used chemical weapons in this country 6 years ago. The fear is that they might use even more. But as far as we know, and there is no evidence to suggest to the contrary, that Ukraine doesn't have any chemical weapons and hasn't used any.
Yeah. Well, we'll be watching that situation to see if they continue doing it. And they have been for the last few months, as you and I have spoken about it numerous times. But Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.